So
Of
welcome
course.
to the OmniBOR call. For those of you listening in, we currently hold this call every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Pacific. So if you'd like to join us, please do. In terms of in terms of the meeting, we have an attendees list. So if you would like to, please add yourself to the meeting notes. And let's jump into agenda. Do we have any new people that would like to introduce yourselves? Not hearing anything. Any news that people would like to share? Okay, not hearing anything. So with that, jumping into the CFPs. So we have a CFP tracking spreadsheet. If there is any CFP that you are applying to that is OmniBOR related, please consider adding it to this list. Do we want to jump into? Yeah, let's jump into it. So Ed and I were talking about doing something for OpenSSF Day. So I'll add us to that to that list. That'll be for May 10th.
Okay, and the deadline, the CP deadline for that is the 17th. So that's next week. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like the Linux Security Summit is already passed. Did anyone? Do we have anyone who submitted for that we know of?
Not that I know of.
Okay, so what I recommend we do is we leave it here unless we not hear anything, and then if we don't hear anything soon, and then we can annotate it or remove it.
Great.
Cool.
We do have RESTConf coming up. It looks like Andrew has noted that he's submitting.
Yes, and I put this is back in the agenda tracker for the day that I will have to get my submission through MITRE's public release process, which is out of my control for how long that takes. So I'm going to try to get it in as quickly as possible so that can get churning. And but that's just a possible concern.
Fair enough.
So I assume the CFP has already been submitted. It's just waiting for MITRE's responses. Is that correct?
No, I need to write it, and that's putting more of a fire under me to make sure I get it in quickly, just so that it can get through MITRE's public release process. I got the confirmation from our public release folks yesterday that it will have to go through prior to CFP submission. So, yeah.
I understand. Sorry. Cool. So if there's any other conferences people hear about, please don't hesitate to add it onto here even after the call is done, and that'll be helpful. I'll also add the KubeCon stuff to this later on.
Oh,
cool. With this, we have the next topic. A reminder to please start reaching out to language and build tools, to build tool communities. So if we could have that opened up, that would be fantastic. Cool. So first question is, are there any updates to this page that people would like to highlight?
No news on my side. I know several of the folks that I work with or was chasing with these things have been getting pulled in different directions. So yeah, it's kind of slowed down with all the tech layoffs, just impacting everyone's workloads. So
yeah, and that's completely understandable as well. So if anyone needs help as well, whether it's due to a time conflict or just generally need to slow down a little bit, also please definitely speak up, and one of us in the community can very likely help fill in. Okay, so with that, let's move on to the next. We've already spoken about upcoming, or we've not spoken about upcoming conferences yet, have we?
We did speak
Or no,
about CFPs. So I think this is a duplicate now, and we can collapse. Yep, I see Andrew's comment down here. I'm going to just move that up since we changed the order. And I think we can delete a chunk of this since this
okay,
is
fantastic.
duplicative now. That was good info.
Yeah, if we can copy that rather than delete at the moment, and I'll go in afterwards and I'll make sure that
Yeah, I
everything
mean, we
is
have this
copied.
copied in many previous days' minutes.
Okay, then feel free to delete that. I don't know when.
We're not losing any info, but I do want to actually keep the at least this one line, or yeah, this line as a reference for us in every meeting.
Perfect. Okay. And
Great. That was that. And now we have blog post feedback, no updates from me, no updates from Chris.
okay,
I think
so
POCs and spec discussion.
so in terms of POCs, I did, and I mentioned this last week, but not in the voice. I did rename the Go reference implementation to OmniBOR-Go. And I did refactor the, excuse me, I did refactor the code base to reference OmniBOR rather than GitBomb. It is possible I may have missed a few things. If anyone runs across such a missed thing, please feel free to open a pull request and we'll get that merged in. But it should be fully branded to OmniBOR now. There are no other mechanical changes other than rename. So if you're depending on it, please be aware of the changes there. Are there any other topics on POCs that people would like to discuss? Not hearing anything. So with that, let's move to questions from implementers. Are there any questions that people have? And not hearing anything, so let's move on to the road to initial spec. Restore Annex B on ELF embedding. So who would like to speak on this? Ava, what's your recommendation on this? Do we want to read through some of this, or is there a specific
Right.
specific task?
So I have a separate issue or PR that I submitted actually yesterday that does say input manifest rather than artifact input manifest, and specifically what the PR does in terms of making changes to the spec. The big thing is just adding an intro section that basically introduces this language. There's a couple of other things, including some general sort of file organization and cleanup stuff that makes the overall diff a little bit unwieldy. It's a little bit easier if you look at the individual commit view. I don't think that the other changes that we're talking about necessarily need to stall on all being consistent with this nomenclature. Like we can go through and do some rewrites and further tinkering on. So like if we want to restore Annex B and then from there rework it to use the new sort of terminology, artifact identifier, input manifest, artifact dependency graph consistently. Like I think we can do that without it blocking.
Yeah, I agree with all the comments pertaining to the contents have been addressed. I think the only pending ones are consistency with the naming as Andrew mentioned. So I think this can be merged if no other objections.
Bharati, are you referring to Andrew's PR that I have on the screen right now?
Oh,
or
sorry. On my
Annex B?
window, the Annex B was open, so I got confused. So
Oh, okay.
the first one that Frederick opened, he started with the Annex B, right?
Gotcha.
And I'll say for that, like anything that we merge, I'm happy to rebase and, you know, fix up stuff so I'm not causing Git headaches for anyone.
Yeah, so on this one, all the comments have been addressed. And I think the pending comments are the new naming convention. So when the other PR is closed, we can pick up the finalized conventions and put it back here. That's the only pending thing.
Okay.
So is this something we want to merge now, or do we want it to leave it open for a bit longer?
Yeah, it looks like it's been open for about a month without any substantial concerns or objections raised.
Yeah, the item where it spawned another thread is whether to use the consistency between OmniBOR identifier, Gitoid, and the artifact dependency graph identifier, etc. And then we said, should we name it artifact input manifest, etc. And so it led to a new PR. So yeah, whatever we decide on that would need to be patched back in here.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering is the substance of this PR, number 28, is, Gitoid persistence, but the only concern folks have with it right now is the terminology. And yes, we've all changed some of these names a bit, and that is open in other PRs. We could merge this for the substance, and then the next one, Andrew, yours might get refiddled a little bit just to get the naming settled.
Yeah.
That sounds good to me.
That'd be my preference as well. So that way we're not having to work across multiple PRs for this.
Totally. Yeah. Welcome, Jeremy.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, I will add my +1 to this. There's where's my review and approve? I don't see any other approvals on here right now. Does that let me? No. I always find the review thing on these gets a little bit lost sometimes.
Yeah, especially when there's an update, some of the reviews tend to fall off, if I recall.
Yeah. Yeah, because I don't want to merge. I mean, I could merge, but I don't see any other approvals just for record keeping on here.
Well, what I recommend is we follow the process then. So once we get an approval, then let's go ahead and merge it in.
Yep. That works for me.
Yeah, I'm confused as well. I only see a merge and no separate approve thing. So I don't know what that means.
Yeah. There should be a review, and we've there we go.
Yeah, I've just submitted an approving review.
Okay. I'm so used to using prow and things where I can just do like a / command in the chat.
We can add prow if you like. That is.
It's a little overkill. It's a little overkill. You're all getting to witness my unfamiliarity with small GitHub projects. I'm used to big ones. We'll come back to that, so I feel less embarrassed about that.
Well, we'll make mini prof for you later on.
Okay.
Cool. So with that, let's move on to the next one. So we have responses to some general observation questions on the spec link.
Yeah, this looks like the general intro section that Andrew, you just posted. Is that right? Oh, Ed also has one.
That's interesting. Ed was the one who told me to take a crack at writing one. Didn't realize he maybe had one already open.
Okay, let's resolve the differences between those. That's PR 30. And where is yours, Andrew? PR 44.
Yeah,
Yes.
I will say, working with Ed quite a lot, that recently he switched to a new task manager or task list. So he's extremely good at following up on the details, but sometimes the memory of who said what, there's just too many to keep track of. So it's possible that he may ask you to do something and then perhaps not forget to annotate it, just as a heads up.
Okay. Do we want to try and resolve those differences now or just note this and follow up offline?
Yeah, what I'm happy to do is I can just take a look through the intersection that he'd written and make sure that the one that I've drafted at the very least covers the same sort of key materials out of it.
Great. Yeah, it looks like yours is much more complete. Ed's, just from a quick glance, looks much like the one that Ed and I wrote last year.
Mhm. Well,
So-
as I think too that this one, Ed's, predates the more recent conversations around terminology.
Yep. Sounds good.
Nice.
Great. Works for me.
Okay, so we have a proposal to only generate OmniBOR when OmniBOR dir is specified.
Yeah, this is a big one. Whether the embed or to not embed and the option or not option or default option discussions are linked, and Ed and I have been having some pretty big conversations over the past couple of weeks. I think last week's call, we also touched on that.
So since Ed is not here, do we want to have a continued discussion on this, or should we punt to next week?
I think it would be good to punt. I'm happy to recap for folks. This also might be easier after we merge Andrew's introduction, get everyone on the same page about terminology. In particular, I'm thinking of the terminology that we've begun using, at least Ed and I have begun using, around strong reproducibility versus weak reproducibility, and some of the guarantees that occur when you are embedding or not embedding. Different guarantees occur when you don't embed. And different guarantees sort of fall out of second order effects if OmniBOR is only generated when by some tools some of the time, like when people opt in, rather than all tools. So there's implications there I think we want to explore after we merge and all get on the same page about terminology and embedding.
Can I just, when you say reproducibility, what specifically do you mean here?
I've begun using the terms strong and weak reproducibility to shorthand forward and backwards. I'll see if I've had enough coffee to explain this. When given a binary, do I have a guarantee that I can rebuild that exact binary from some sources? Given a set of sources, can I guarantee that the binary they build came only from those sources, not from any other sources? The challenge is hello world. There are a million ways and a million input files that produce the same output if the only executable or interpretable code is the minimum set, a hello world example with variable comments. Right? Many different input files produce the same hello.o.
Right. So I think
if we embed the input file hashes in the output, we now have a different reproducibility guarantee because the hello.o now varies dependent on the inputs, even though the functionality does not vary based on those input variances.
right. So if I paraphrase it as, so the concept I've had in my mind is the distinction between being able to verify whether or not you have successfully reproduced a build and including enough information to be able to reproduce the build as being two distinct things. And I think that's a bit different from what you just described.
Could you clarify the first one again?
The first one is being able to use OmniBOR to verify that you have successfully reproduced a build. And the second is there's enough information in OmniBOR to be able to reproduce the build.
Yeah, I think that is a different distinction than the one I'm pointing at.
Okay. No, I think you're right. I understand what you mean now. Like with the embedding, it does make a much more stringent connection between output artifacts and input artifacts.
Yeah, and in a way that is in many situations counterproductive to certain use cases.
Right, and it particularly comes up with the discussion that well, Andrew and I have been primarily having around the convergence and divergence and the input tagging.
Yeah.
Because if you embed the manifest ID in the output artifacts, then it kind of makes the whole, input tagging as a way of stripping back the manifests in order to exclude information you don't care about moot, because the artifacts themselves are already bound to a very specific graph. Whereas if you allow for external manifests, then you can have any number of distinct manifest graphs that refer to the same artifacts at different levels of detail.
Precisely. And so I think the way to address this is first we get all of the terminology and updates sort of in this section merged, and then we all collectively spend a little time, defining these terms. You've proposed convergence and divergence. I've been using strong and weak. I think we're pointing at many of the same concepts that we're all, bumping into. We need to be on the same page about that to decide which path forward when it comes to embedding and storing things separately. I do think this is a really pivotal decision in the spec.
We'll point out there's also a comment in the chat about OmniBOR non-embedding mode, where there's different semantics and whether it's an issue, that it's not an issue for reproducibility in non-embedding mode.
I do believe that is what we're discussing, yes.
Cool.
So I didn't understand, is there a distinct, are you going to be using some of the bits in the SHA to distinguish between, I guess, weak or strong reproducibility?
Not some of the bits in the SHA, at least not as I understand the way things are going, but rather whether the SHA is embedded in the output artifact or written somewhere parallel to the output artifact, but not embedded.
I see. If you've got like a SHA-1, you've got 32 bits to play with, and you're not using it for cryptographic purposes. I was kind of thinking 1 or 2 bits can be used to indicate like a do not care condition.
Could you say more about that? What would that indicate?
I mean, I was just thinking about it last night, so it could possibly be a fairly stupid idea, but so the way I was looking at strong and weak, or convergent or divergent, would be sort of, do you have what's called the do not care condition, where you've compiled something, it's got a different hash or whatever because you've used a certain flag when you compiled it, but at the end of the day, it's equivalent to your hello world example. It's equivalent to something else. It's just that you don't care about the difference because you used a flag that isn't relevant to whether to the overall discussion, which is whether X is in Y, component X is in Y. So you can I think that's really what people are going to care about, right? If you want to talk about reproducible builds, it's to me, again, I could be entirely wrong about this, but you want to be able to say, what are the contents of a build, and if some flag was used and it doesn't really have, make a difference at the end of the day. If someone were building something and they knew that,
So I think that's the one of the sort of motivations behind my input tagging proposal, so that in the manifest you tag each input to a particular build step with what its role is, and so then that gives you the ability to come through later on and strip out the inputs you don't care about, and then recompute the OID for that new manifest. And then if that turns out to generate the same OID as some other build, then they're equivalent as far as you're concerned, even if they may have some other differences that the full manifest would make them different.
Yeah, I see. So I was thinking of something slightly different, but maybe you're right. I wasn't thinking about stripping things out, but simply saying that it's still there, you just don't care.
Well, that's effectively the same thing, right?
Here's I think the issue that misses. If each of the three of us handwrite hello world, and we include different white spaces and different comments, when we compile and embed that source tree, that artifact input manifest, into the output hello.o, the hash of that hello.o will be different for each of us, even though if we did not embed, the hash would be the same. And so we've broken reproducibility because we have built a binary that is identical, except for the hash that we embedded, which contains non-functional differences only. If we do not embed, but we store the artifact tree separately, and the artifact input manifest is linked separately from the output artifact itself, then hello.o is byte for byte identical between all three of us. And we have separate from it, adjacent to it, that record of the differences in our input trees.
So the .c file would have a different hash. The .o file would have, and the .exe would have the same hashes.
That's what I'm calling strong reproducibility. Sorry, a weak reproducibility. Right? The hello.o's would have the same hash, even though their inputs were different. I'm calling that weak. And that is the case that most folks seem to want when I ask what you want out of reproducibility. The difference being if we embed the hash of the input manifests in hello.o or hello.exe, then those hashes vary, and we have a different type of reproducibility now.
And in the terminology that I introduced, I would say that if you're not embedding the hashes, then those two different builds starting from different sources would converge, because you would end up with artifacts with the same hash, and you would end up with a graph of manifest objects that end up being shared between those two builds.
Yeah, and I think your description, your terminology is more descriptive than mine. Calling that convergence, we can show how multiple graphs converge on the same byte for byte equivalent artifact when we don't embed the hashes.
So I think part of the conversation here should also be not just on the technical side, because the technical path, we can easily get into which direction we should head to or another. But also we should ask the question as to what do we gain or lose on the administrative path. And to give you an example, I may have two files that would normally produce the same binary. The only thing that's different is, let's say, the white space in the comments. In this scenario, though, let's say the comments in one file have a license of let's say, Affero GPL, and the other one has a license of, let's say, Apache. At that time, the actual functionality of it doesn't really matter, but being able to say this came from an Apache-based thing, or this came from an Affero-based code base, could be incredibly important in determining whether you want to accept that that file or not.
Without wanting to delve into like copyright law and IP stuff, but my gut instinct, well, too much, is that if you have non-functional changes in the input source, as far as the output artifact is concerned, that has no effect on the like. You can make a case that it doesn't have any effect on the sorry, I'm going to back off. That's a legal question that I can't answer, but I'm not sure that it makes sense to talk about the license of comments independently of anything else.
Yep, I think that we have when Ed initially brought up, we could use GitBOM or OmniBOR to track licenses. My first reaction was, hey, that's scope creep, let's not. And this is exactly why. Right.
I mean, it can be, in some cases, people will statically embed a licensing string so that it can be retrieved later. In which case the .os and .xes would have different hashes.
Yeah, I see Bharati put a comment in chat, but another variable would be the compiler link or build options that could also affect the hash of the binary. Absolutely true, but I think that's a different type of variability. Even when we don't embed, those options can and often do change the hash of the output binary. That is a functional change.
Right, but in the context of reproducibility, that's another variable to be included.
Absolutely, but it's not the question of whether to embed or not embed the artifact input manifest hash. I think that's a different question.
Yeah.
The question that you might be pointing at is, should we include in the artifact input manifest some way of capturing the build options?
So my understanding is it will come under metadata as per previous discussion. So that's another, I think that's another branch that we have to fork on the slide. Yeah.
Indeed. So I think that's sort of the big decision point that we have in front of us in designing the spec. I have to drop for another call in a few minutes, but I would love to see in the next week or so all of the sort of cleanup and some of the older stuff like, Annex B, Alpha Embedding, Andrew and Ed's work, all of that merged so that we can really get to focusing on these questions in the next couple meetings.
Yeah, I agree.
So one particular question, and anyway, this is my question specifically for you. Do we need you and Ed for the remainder of the agenda? Because if we do, then we can yield the time and reconvene next week. If not, we can continue on.
It looks like this question is pretty similar to what we were just discussing. To embed or not embed, that is what we were just discussing. And then this one probably doesn't need me. If anyone has been or wants to chat about working on doing a POC in a dynamic language or non-compiled language, Java, Python, something like that, I don't think that needs me and Ed to chat about that. And then the last one about moving towards a standards path, that's probably doesn't need me and Ed. So I'd say this one is a great one for folks to pick up without us, if anyone wants to.
Okay, so I recommend that that's our next topic for when after you drop that.
Cool. Great chats. Thank you all for the discussions today. So that I can't say the whole time.
Thank you. So Ava was sharing their screen. So I don't have a way to share at the moment since I'm on my cell phone. So if someone would like to share, that would be good. But if not, we can read off the topic. And the topic is about POCs for 2 more domains before proposing a spec to an SDL. The 2 areas that we should probably have are in a dynamically loaded language, for example, Java, and a non-compiled language, for example, Python. My guess is that it doesn't have to be Java or Python. They're used primarily as an example. So if someone else has experience or enjoyment of working on a different language, that's certainly a possibility. And an optional build package system like RPMs or OCI. So let's jump in. Does anyone want to work on a dynamically loaded language in POC?
I don't have enough experience in that domain to feel like I could do that, but I am curious about what the goal would be. Like what outcome would you want?
I think that's part of what we want to try to work out. So it is, there were some slides in previous presentations of OmniBOR where we would we showed all the stuff we've been talking about has been like static, as in we compile, it generates some metadata, and then is released. The next level up from that would be, let's say that we stuck with the standard ELF world. The shared objects themselves could possibly have their own OmniBOR identifier attached to them, and I apologize if I'm not using the right term here. I will, once we get settlement on the exact terms, I will become consistent. And when you combine the static binary, or not static binary, but the dynamically linked library with the actual library that you're linking into, it is possible to generate a OmniBOR identifier that within a kernel process or similar, you could say this is exactly what was running and provide a more complete view of the world. And so, given that exact example, it should be possible to do that within a JVM, where if a class file statically, or not statically, but compiled offline and then loaded, came with an OmniBOR identifier, and you load some number of omnivores identifiers, we could put together some kind of a manifest or some kind of a list of OmniBOR identifiers themselves using the manifest format that we have, in order to show at a given moment in time, these are the type of things that were loaded in a more reproducible way. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think it raises a lot more.
And that's the intention, is to raise questions, because there's also the question whether this is even valuable. Is it doable? Is it valuable?
So the thing that this strikes me as being most analogous to is like the secure boot process coming up from like measuring artifacts, measuring bootloaders and then kernels and so on as you're booting up, in order to work out whether or not your system is coming up into a state that's based on sort of known artifacts. I think this case is much more difficult because the environment's a lot less constrained, and there's also a lot more dynamic stuff going, like particularly for Python, where you could load a Python class and then you could load another Python class, and that second class just stomps and completely changes the functionality of the first one by monkey patching it or something like that. So it's not even clear exactly what it, like at any given instant, you could potentially compute a virtual input manifest that consists of all of the artifacts that you've loaded so far, but as soon as you load the next one, it could completely invalidate it.
Yeah, interestingly, that's also true to a degree. Not still more constricted, but still true for the JVM itself, in that all functions are dynamically dispatched, and it is possible to patch systems dynamically in a way that that changes that behavior. A really good example of this is some of the aspect-oriented programming libraries that exist out there that are able to either wrap the behavior, or in some scenarios completely replace entire function calls, or method calls rather.
So I think, like, my conception of this kind of OmniBOR scheme is that effectively you're producing a graph that records the history of a prior build, like a build that has happened, and this set of manifest artifacts and so on are a description of that build. But what we're talking about here is effectively, like in a language like Java, what you would think of as the link step in a C++ program is deferred until runtime. And so the build is not really completed until runtime. Like you could have manifests for each individual jar file or whatever. But that's kind of where you have to stop. But like once the program has executed and then terminated, you might be able to generate a manifest that represents that execution as being a sort of very elaborate form of dynamic link or linking step.
But here's another
C++ with shared objects.
But here's another question as well. With something like C, would the same be true about C, where an application can change its own memory to change its behavior? So I think that the same thing still exists. It's harder to do in C, but I think the behavior, the possibility of it is still there. And so perhaps part of the question then is what's the utility? At what kind of claims do we want to make? Like maybe the claims are, these are the class files we loaded, but we say nothing about what they actually did or how they interacted with each other. And maybe that gets us to a better place, but at the same time, we don't overstate the claims or the attestations that we're making.
Yeah, I mean, with C, you have exactly the same thing where you can just DL open something that replaces a bunch of like C, libc symbols or something like that, and that's kind of equivalent to what we're talking about. And I think this goes back to what I was just saying, is that if we regard the entire OmniBOR system as a after the fact accounting of what happened during a build, and that things that happen dynamically during execution are out of scope, then that kind of simplifies the question. But I think maybe even the more fundamental way of stepping back is just saying, like, what problems do you actually want to solve? Like, it's easy to come up with elaborate things that solve problems that no one actually has. And in this case, you know, obviously for Java, if you're talking about Java, then you're saying, well, how would you deal with log4j? Like, what does your system do to help me track down all of the users of log4j? And like, there's a fairly easy answer there. Like, we have an OmniBOR artifact ID for bad and good log4j jar files, and then we can look to see which executions ended up consuming bad and good ones, and then we can like work out how to mitigate it from there. And that doesn't require anything terribly fancy as far as runtime instrumentation goes.
Yeah, I suspect that you're right here. That's along the lines that I'm thinking as well. It's if it's to answer the question of something like, am I vulnerable to a given CVE? I don't have a way to answer that unless I know what else was loaded dynamically at that particular time. And if it can give us that answer in terms of what was loaded in an easy way, in a way, then that's definitely valuable. And I do think there is some scanners that can definitely help with that. But it's the same thing as image scanners within compile languages that don't have a runtime. That how do you know exactly what was compiled into them, or whether those things have, like, what are the properties there, or things that they loaded. So that provenance, I think, is missing from such scanners. So there would definitely be value there. And I think if we draw the line at what the class loader does after it's been loaded into it, I think is a fine line to draw. And if someone wants to build on top of that at a later time to do something really clever, then perhaps like they certainly can do so. But I think limiting ourselves to an initial, especially with an initial POC, to something that is small in scope, that doesn't try to boil the ocean, and maybe it never progresses beyond the initial scope of the POC, because we get enough value out of that in order to make the decisions we want. That would be a fantastic outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder even about, like, to what extent can you rely on a class loader? Like, once, from a security perspective, if you're worried about malicious artifacts ending up in your executable, like in your execution environment, in your JVM instance, like, could they subvert the whole process so that you can't even trust what the class loader is doing? And like, if you're relying on the class loader to log what jar files it is asked to fetch, can you rely on that? Like, the nice thing about instrumenting a build is that, assuming that you trust your build tools, it's all done. So like, any later like subversion of the process is irrelevant, because it can't retroactively change what happened in the past.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Although the same question comes up with build systems as well. Part of the way that I try to reason about that is we should never place our trust on just one thing. And so if it's just the class loader, then it's like, what are we defending against at that particular point? If the class, so I think that there are classes of problems that OmniBOR can help us solve, where we have the assumption the class loader has not been compromised, where it's still useful, but it is a risk that the class loader has been compromised. And so I think it would still be valuable to collect information, and then when you're trying to mitigate a specific threat, or type of threat, the question then becomes, do you trust the information for this based upon what is being attested or what's being claimed? And I think that there's two parts to it. So first of them is they're all signals, and whether you trust that signal, the amplitude of that trust is certainly an exercise to work through as an observer. The second one is providing more information also increases the total cost to an attacker. So let's say that you have a compromised system, and let's say it's been compromised at the kernel level. And let's say that you're producing OmniBOR information and streaming them in as you execute them. One of them is, let's say there's like an eBPF filter or something the kernel is reporting on, and then you have something that Java itself the JVM is reporting on. So that's two bits of information they have to correlate and get right and send up to the CM. And if they're incorrect, then it sets off some alert or what was approved to run on that particular system. It's like the attacker may not know what was there. So when you start to look at the long-term arc of where this thing may go, having more information, even if it can be compromised, can still increases the total cost and risk to an attacker. So definitely agree. But I also think that there's still value in doing it, even if it can be compromised. Layers of defenses as well.
And I guess the other question is that, like OmniBOR itself, like nothing we've talked about in the spec gives any of that sort of assurance information to the manifests themselves. We don't have any signatures or anything like that. So it's still on whoever's generating and consuming these things to have their own independent trust relationship with whoever, between the consumers and the generators of this data. And like
Absolutely.
a potential further conversation that we can have is like, how would you introduce digital signatures into the OmniBOR scheme without breaking all of its other existing properties, like having external signatures for manifests or something like that? But I don't want to delve into that. The other question about this particular topic is a more practical one, which is whatever scheme you come up with, you have to make sure that it doesn't accidentally put stronger constraints on like execution time and things than currently exists. So for example, with the .so file, it can be arbitrarily large, and it takes effectively a constant time to DL open it, and then pages are only fetched incrementally as they're used. And if you put into place a constraint that you actually have to hash the entire .so file, then that could vastly change the like big O complexity of loading a .so file.
That's an excellent point, and that's probably something that we should mention in the annex as well for embedded for embedded OmniBOR identifiers. Interestingly, we had the same set of conversations back in the early Docker image format before OCI was ever a thing, about whether we wanted to hash the contents cryptographically or not. And but the problem with changing something like ELF is that if we were at the start of that path, maybe there'd be something there, but the fact that so many systems exist and rely upon the performance of the system certainly does add additional constraints.
Yeah, and I think from an OmniBOR point of view, like I really like the model that an artifact is an atom, and you take like an artifact in OmniBOR terms is a string of bytes that you can feed into a hash function to produce an OID, and then that's your like fundamental unit of reference. And anytime you start talking about a scheme where you only want to hash part of a file, or like have some other sort of conditional hashing sort of scheme, then it seems to me that the OmniBOR answer to that is that you take the original artifact and then you do some derivation on it to produce the normalized output, and then you run get OID on that, rather than and so if you wanted to extract only interesting parts of an ELF file or something like that, you would come up with potentially a sort of pseudo artifact that represents that abstraction of the ELF file in order to hash over it.
Well, let me stop you right here because we are literally at the top of the hour. So I'll definitely think more on it as well. And thanks for the interesting discussion. I think we should definitely pick this up in a future meeting. And I'll make sure an issue is open about this as well, so we can also put ideas down on an issue. With that, want to thank everyone for your time, and we'll see you all at the next meeting next week. Take care.